So let's read some other accounts of Derby's dose. Now, I read some from here, from Wikipedia, but here's something else that I wanted to bring you brothers to right here. Okay, it was a book written by Dr. R.A. Millwood. Okay, and his title is PhD the Minister or something like that. But this book was written by him. I mean, not that his name is really important, but I remember, I believe I read like 3 or 4 pages out of this book before. But as I was reading amongst those 3 to 4 pages, I've learned of other things that have also happened to our people during the time of slavery that was also not taught to us in school. Because at least when I was a little kid, you know, I was taught about, how my people were slaves and and how slavery was cruel and all. But they never told us about Derby's dose. Okay? They never told us about Derby's dose. And yeah, you brothers probably didn't notice, but they actually used to have what was called toilet slaves, where they would have like a male or female slave sitting somewhere. I don't know if it was a barn or an empty cabin, but they'd have them like tied up in their head strap to the wall somewhere. And then whenever they had to pee or shit, they just go in that cabin and they would literally piss inside of the mouth. The slave master would piss inside of the mouth of the slave, or if he had to shit, he would shit. I mean, he would sit on the slave's. He would sit on the slave's face and shit in their mouth. Okay? So they actually had something called toilet slaves. And, Lord's will, I'm going to look more into that. But here's more information on Derby's dose. Okay? It says, God and the invention of a Caucasian Jesus without historical evidence. As an African descendant, it is my moral and academic right to critique the people who brutally enslaved my ancestors. I'm trying to cross the street here. Give me a second. Okay. Nefariously. It says the myths and the mendici. Hold on. And mendicities are mind-blowing. It is important to critique the Bible that was used for theological justification of the brutal enslavement of my ancestors, racially and sadistically. Okay, notice how you put sadistically in there. It says free sex was the preoccupation of the slavers, missionaries, planters, and slave masters. Contextualization is a challenge to the theological and philosophers of religion. Okay, scholarships without the contextualization of the egregious so-called African Holocaust in human chronological history, the British transatlantic chattel slave trade, and African bodies in the name of God, and British Semitic cultural Christianity must be contextualized and the reparations movement. For the meaning of contextualization, function of contextualization, and application of contextualization, see the scholarly contribution of Proof James Cone book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, 2011, published by Orbis Books, and why. Is that a SWAT truck? That shit said Looms on it. Okay, so let's see if I can, let's see, British planters, slavers, and slave masters buried African slaves alive. Okay, gibbet African slaves alive, shit in the mouth of slaves. Okay, shit in the mouth of slaves. Now check that out. So it wasn't just, it wasn't just slave owners in Jamaica that was shitting in the mouth of the slaves. Guess what? The British slave masters were doing it too. They were shitting in the mouth of slaves. Now check that out. Okay? Okay? Shit in the mouth of slaves. So British planters, slavers, and slave masters buried African slaves alive. Okay, give me a second here. Okay. Okay, shit in the mouth of slaves and tied the slaves' mouths in the sun for hours. Decapitated the heads of slaves. Okay, tied slaves to 4 horses and had the slaves pulled into 4 quarters. Tied decomposed goats to the naked body of slaves and forced the slaves to live with the decomposed goats until the slaves are infected and died. Hanged African slave women by one leg on a tree limb for the crows to eat them alive for refusing to have sex with the planters, with the slave owners. And slave masters shooting babies for target practice, cutting slaves slowly for 2 weeks until the slaves died. Locked slaves in cages without food and water unto death. So they was even starving slaves to death. Stripped African slave men, women, and children naked and placed them in cow, horses, donkeys, pigs, and goats, and told the slaves that they were all animals. It figurated. Planters and slave masters deliberately sexed their slaves for inbreeding order to improve their slaves' populations. On the plantations, jettisoned African slaves alive into the Atlantic Ocean for insurance claims. So the Zong massacre, shaving off the soles of the feet of slaves and forced them to walk and work on sugar plantations. Okay, public hanging of slaves for excitement and pleasure, and the demonstration of white superiority and African inferiority and disempowerment, forcing slaves to dig their own graves before they were shot dead. Cutting off the fingers, ears, lips, nose, and hands of the slaves before they were shot dead. At times, slaves were forced to eat their own fingers, noses, ears, lips, and cutting out of the eyes of the slaves, cutting off the legs of the slaves. Okay, hold on.